Good afternoon, teachers. Today we're going to take a look at the introduction that I do to the AP Macro Unit 4A. So 4A is going to cover banking and the financial sector, and then we're going to break that into 4B, where we'll cover monetary policy. So I decided to break those up into two mini units because I think they're fundamentally different from each other, and I want to be able to test them separately. So I think this is the way I'm going to do it going forward. So the intro lesson for Unit 4A that I tend to do is Intro to Money. This is a relatively brief lesson. It takes me about one 45-minute class period, and in it, generally I do two things. So we'll go over kind of the notes that I talk about here today, and then in addition, this corresponds with the artifact analysis that I posted on the Google Classroom. So I'll usually start off the class with the artifact analysis and get them brainstorming about what money is and what can and can't be money and why we have money. And then we'll kind of transition after about 15 or 20 minutes of artifact analysis into the notes to kind of clarify exactly what it was I wanted them to get out of the activity. So I don't spend more than about 45 minutes on this. Nothing in here is particularly difficult. So let me run through the basics of the notes, keeping in mind that these take place after I do the artifact analysis or whatever intro activity to the unit that you want to do. So essentially, we're going to answer three essential questions here. The first of which is kind of the obvious question, which is, what is money? And what the kids need to know about this is that money is anything that can be used as a medium of exchange, as a long-term store of value, and as a unit of account. So essentially, there's three main requirements for things to be considered money, and those are your three big ones. Medium of exchange means that it has to be something that can be used in lieu of barter. So it's basically going to take the barter system where we needed what's called a coincidence of wants. So I had to have something you wanted, and you have to have something I wanted, and we had to agree on the relative value of those two things. That's too annoying. There's no way that transactions on a large scale are going to get done there. So we're going to rely on money as kind of a middleman, right? Money isn't valuable in and of itself, but it's valuable because it's kind of a lubricant to the trade process and allows us to exchange goods for money rather than having to find somebody else who had other goods that we wanted. So anything that can be used as a medium of exchange is kind of generally acceptable is going to be useful as money here. Money also pretty much has to be something that has a long-term store of value. So I need to be able to put money away for future use. So this would exclude anything that goes bad, right? Pumpkins are not a good item to use as money because they have a relatively short shelf life and they'll rot if we don't use them. You don't want to save for retirement in chickens or anything like that. So it has to be something that has a long-term store of value. And finally, it has to be something that can be used as a unit of account, so something that is generally believed to have value and something that everyone more or less agrees roughly what the value of that thing is. So as long as it's usable as a medium of exchange, can be a long-term store of value, and can be a unit of account, it can be money. Doesn't have to be coins, doesn't have to be paper. It could be seashells or shiny rocks or whatever you want to use for money, as long as it meets those three main requirements. Moving on, we're going to go to the next question, and our main focus of the next question are what are the characteristics of things they're going to make for good money. So while theoretically almost anything that meets these three requirements could be money, some things certainly are going to be better being used for money than others. So let's go over the main characteristics of what good money is going to be. So when trying to differentiate items that would be good to use as money versus items that would be bad to use as money, I like to tear these down into essentially six main categories. And anything that basically checks off all six of these boxes is going to be something that's kind of your ideal thing to use as money. So we know that, gold coins were used for money for hundreds of years. One of the reasons is because, for the most part, they're going to check off all six of these boxes. Again, it doesn't have to be gold. It could be anything, as long as it goes over kind of the main characteristics that make one form of money better than others. The good news is they all end with the same suffix, so we're going to be able to kind of rhyme them together here. Characteristic of money number one is durability. This goes in with that long-term store of value. Has to be something that's not easily broken, something that doesn't go bad, and something that will be basically the same many, many years in the future. This is one of gold's main benefits as a type of money is, it's been there for millions of years. Gold is still going to be gold in 100 years. You can save it. The second main thing, and somewhere where gold kind of falls apart, is going to be portability. So it has to be something that you can reasonably move from one place to another without it becoming a major issue. So it can't be too heavy, it can't be too large. Also, it has to have enough relative value that you don't need large quantities of it. So while salt, for example, was used as money back in the day, nowadays salt is relatively prevalent, and you probably wouldn't want to use it as money because it would require so much salt to buy anything that it would be a problem to transport. So it needs to be something that's portable, and really, to make sure that that's reasonable, it needs to be something that has some amount of value so that you don't have to move around too much of it in order to make a purchase. Characteristic number 3 is that items we're going to use as money have to have divisibility, meaning that it has to be something that you can break into smaller pieces in order to make smaller transactions possible. This would be done with gold and gold bars by just breaking off a piece of the gold and weighing it, but there's other forms of money that might be usable in this particular regard. So it has to be something you can break apart and it won't change its value. So you wouldn't want to have like pigs as money, because you can't just cut off a quarter of a pig and maintain its value. It's just not going to work out that way. Number 4, the money has to be uniform. So we're looking for uniformity here, meaning that it can't be something that's one of a kind. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to agree on its relative value. So these forms of money, it has to be something that there's enough of to have enough of a supply of money that lots of people can be using it for transactions all at the same time. While at the same time, getting to number 5, it can't be too common, because money has to have scarcity. So this has to be something that is hard to get a hold of, but not so hard to get a hold of there wouldn't be enough of it to be used. So this is where, we can either create false scarcity, as is the case with our, paper money, or something that is naturally relatively scarce. Gold, silver, those types of things are going to make good for money. Keep in mind, as we're going to get into in the next video, that relative scarcity is one of the components for determining the value of money. So the more rare something is, generally speaking, the higher the value is going to be in trade. And that's why we're going to have our fiat currency in a second, where we can actually artificially control that scarcity. Last, and probably most important, money has to have general acceptability. So it has to be something that is valuable to pretty much everyone. So while you may really, really like stamps, stamps aren't going to be good for money because they're not generally acceptable, right? They may have value within a small circle of collectors, but they don't have value in the general population. Like, I wouldn't know an expensive stamp from a cheap stamp. And so whatever you're going to use as money has to be agreed upon by pretty much everyone in the economy, that this is what we're using as money, and that we accept these things in exchange for our goods, our services, or our labor. So durability, portability, divisibility, uniformity, scarcity, and acceptability. If you can check off all of those boxes, you've got something that might make for good money. All right, the last thing that we're going to focus on for this lesson is essentially what are the different categories of money. So today we tend to use fiat currency, but that's a relatively recent development. So let's go over the basics of what are the major categories of money, what are some examples of things that fall under that category, and then we'll talk about why we've decided to go with door number 3 here as opposed to the other options, which were things we used to use. So the first and most obvious thing that we can use as money are commodities, and this is what we call commodity money. Commodities are anything that has intrinsic value. So for example, this could be things like gold coins, or tea, or salt, or if students have been watching a lot of Orange is the New Black, you can point out that in prison you tend to use cigarettes as your form of money. These things are commodity money because each of these items that are being used as money has value in and of itself. Tea has value, it has utility outside of its use of money. Cigarettes have utility outside of their use as money. And so this is something that people want not because they're used as money, but because they want the item itself, right? Gold coins have value not because they're coins, but because they're made out of gold, etc. So for a long time, most of human history, commodity money is what we've been using for trade. So governments would get a hold of a commodity, stamp it like the Roman Empire, and you would trade those currencies. And it doesn't matter if the Roman Empire collapsed, the value of the silver that they used to make their Roman coins remained stable and remained the same. So that's one of the benefits of commodity money, is that it doesn't rely on trust in government. It really doesn't rely on much of anything because the item itself that's being used as money has intrinsic value. However, commodity money can be pretty irritating because especially a lot of these things that we use as commodities, gold and silver, are relatively heavy, relatively hard to transport, and you really don't want to be driving around with a whole bunch of gold in your trunk either because you could lose a lot of your savings. So relatively recently as I believe the 1700s, banks started issuing what is called commodity-backed money, and this was later picked up on by governments in what the students will remember from APUSH as the gold standard. So the idea behind commodity-backed money is that it's essentially a lot of times paper or banknotes that represent a commodity without actually having all the negatives that go along with that commodity itself. So I may have a piece of paper that's worth half an ounce of gold, and that's a lot easier for me to transport, a lot easier for me to use than actually walking around with a half an ounce of gold. So these commodity-backed monies are paper money, but they represent a commodity and can be traded freely for that commodity. It removes a lot of the irritation of having to walk around with a lot of heavy commodities. It also removes the danger of getting all of your stuff stolen. Now all you have to do is secure some paper, which is a lot easier to secure than a ton of gold or 70 packs of cigarettes on your person. Now, you may be asking yourself, why did we move away from commodity money and why did we move away from commodity-backed money like the gold standard? The reason is because governments, for the most part, when we're going to make monetary policy, governments want the ability to control the value of currency. That way we can actually have steps to take in place should we see hyperinflation or, heaven forbid, should we see deflation. The problem with commodity and commodity-backed money is that because the item that's being used as money itself has value, commodity and commodity-backed money are highly susceptible to fluctuations in the value of whatever that commodity happens to be. So let's use the gold standard, for example. If the paper money that I use is backed by X percentage of ounce of gold, then the value of that piece of paper fluctuates up and down with the value of gold. So should gold all of a sudden go up in price on the secondary market, you would see your commodity-backed money experience deflation as that money became more valuable because the gold that it represents becomes more valuable. Governments don't want to be tied to fluctuations in commodity markets because they can't really control those commodity markets, especially today. They're global marketplaces. And the U.S. government doesn't want the dollar experiencing inflation or deflation based on how much gold there happens to be on the open market or whether there was a bumper crop of tea available if we're using tea as our commodity. And so we've generally moved away, with only a couple of exceptions. The world has moved away from commodity and commodity-backed money, primarily because governments want the ability to control the value of their own currencies and not have their currency basically enslaved to the value of whatever the commodity is they're using to back it. So what does that leave us with? Well, if we're getting rid of commodity money and commodity-backed money, that leaves us with our current system, for most countries anyway, and that's going to be fiat currency. Fiat currency, not an Italian budget car, but rather fiat currency is money that is backed by essentially nothing tangible. So US dollars are backed by this kind of esoteric idea of the full faith and credit of the US government. So what does that mean? That means the US government will accept your green pieces of paper in exchange for paying your taxes, and they swear and they promise that those green pieces of paper have value. But it lacks any intrinsic value, right? I mean, there might be a tiny bit of value in the paper in a $100 bill, but it's certainly not $100 worth of intrinsic value. And so fiat currency, you want not because the currency itself is valuable, but you want it because people are willing to accept it in exchange for goods and services. And people are willing to accept it in exchange for goods and services because the government that issued that currency has promised everyone that that currency has a value, not intrinsic value, but has value itself. And provided that everybody involved in the economy agrees to believe the government when the government says that money has value, then the government's money has value. Now, that might lead us to some kind of dodgy situations. As I sit here, I'm staring at a $10 trillion Zimbabwe note, which is a good example of what happens when people stop believing the government when it says that their currencies have value. This is certainly a risk inherent with fiat currency because they're not backed by any tangible asset, but rather they're backed by the full faith and credit of whatever government happened to issue them. If people stop believing in the full faith and credit of their government, they will stop believing in the value of their currencies as well. Now, I think that that's something the kids like to get a little more riled up about than is absolutely necessary. Like, the US dollar isn't going to plunge the way the Zimbabwe dollar did. The US dollar is a reserve currency, and it's much more stable than other types of fiat currency. But it is certainly something, at least theoretically, worth pointing out. So most countries in the world today have fiat currency systems, and the primary reason is because they want to be able to expand and contract the money supply at will to control inflation and deflation, and really fiat currency is the only real way to do that. The US government can, quote unquote print, we'll find out they're not actually printing it, but they can print extra dollars today without having to get a hold of additional gold because we got rid of the gold standard. And so fiat currency allows governments to expand and contract the money supply pretty much at will without any extra steps. And this is the reason why governments generally use fiat currency systems as opposed to others. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how do we calculate the money supply, what counts as money versus what doesn't count as money in the United States. So if you're interested, click on that next video. Thank y'all very much.